This changes everything for the Toronto Maple Leafs as a shocking new report has dropped, revealing some interesting details as it pertains to the Leafs and Scott Laughton, but also some huge details as it pertains to the future of Max Domi, Fraser Minten, Nick Robertson, and even Connor Dewar. We're going to break down this new report and discuss what it means going forward as moves are flying across the NHL. Stay tuned for all that in this episode, but before we get into it, folks, if you're part of the percentage who aren't subscribed to the channel, about 71% of you who are watching right now aren't subscribed. This is the place to be for daily Leafs content. Your guys' support has been unbelievable. Darius, there's a lot to go over today. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of moves going on. Jake Evans just got signed to an extension. We're seeing trades between the Oilers, all these different things. So a couple Leafs targets have been taken off the board, but nothing too crazy. Scott Laughton is still available, and some new reports have dropped. And this is a pretty big one as it pertains to the Leafs' pursuit of the player. So you can see this here. Many people close to Scott Laughton believe that he would love to suit up for his hometown Maple Leafs if there's a trade that makes sense. And this dropped 20 minutes ago. And again, any reports at this point, you had to take them pretty seriously. I mean, we saw a report this morning, I forget who, maybe Pierre LeBrun, someone saying that Jake Evans and Montreal might pivot to actually extending him instead of trading him, and then a few hours later, he gets extended. So he is off the trade market. Now you have Darren Dreger coming out and saying that many people close to Scott Laughton believe that he would love to suit up for his hometown Maple Leafs. This is interesting, and I still feel like Scott Laughton's going to be a Leaf. I have a feeling that the price is going to come down for the Flyers last minute, so I think a Scott Laughton deal might be a bit later on, either in the day-to-day or as we approach Thursday and Friday. What are your thoughts on this, though? It's a good sign if you're a Leafs fan.
It's an interesting sign. I mean, he would want to play for the Leafs. He would want to come home, play for a contender. That all makes sense. He's from here. I say from here, but he's from Oakville, obviously, right? So I think that, would interest him. But we also saw a report the other day that he wouldn't mind staying in Philadelphia either. So that is something to kind of keep in mind that, it sounds like the Flyers organization wants to do right by him with whatever he wants to do, right? But at the same time, which we're going to get to, it looks like the Flyers are trying to shop him and that the Leafs would like to acquire him, but there is something in the way. We're going to get to that in a second. But again, I do think that he would be open to coming here, but at the same time, he said like he wouldn't mind staying with the Flyers. There was another report just yesterday about that, and that the team wants to do right by the player no matter what he wants to do, which makes little sense to me personally if you're the Flyers, because when you want to get some assets in return for this player who is, on an expiring contract next season, and he has some terms, so that is attractive for the Leafs. But it sounds like it could literally go either way at this point, and it sounds at the same time that he's probably only going to go to a contender. We've heard the Jets involved too, the Maple Leafs, so it's going to get very interesting as we creep towards the deadline.
Yeah, I mean, you're at the point now where we've been talking about Scott Laughton for months because he's been the biggest name, the one that makes sense. You talked about him before he was even mentioned in trade talks and reports, and now he is very much a reality for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And it is very, very interesting because you look at what, and we'll get into it in a second, what the actual cost of him will be. We heard Fraser Minten, we've heard first round pick, we've heard all these different things. For a third line center, is he worth that? That's the question. And the Leafs don't think so. And we'll start with this, and then we'll dive into another report surrounding Nick Robertson and the future of him. On today's episode of Daily Faceoff Live, Frank Saravalli said that he was told the Flyers would be interested and willing to do a one-for-one swap of Fraser Minten for Scott Laughton. He also said that that was a no from the Leafs. So Darius, this one is interesting because we've been hearing about it, but this was the first confirmed report that a swap, so there was no picks or anything, just a straight-up swap of Fraser Minten for Scott Laughton was proposed by the Flyers. The Leafs declined it, and this is intriguing, I would say. It makes sense why the Leafs declined it. They're very high on Fraser Minten. However, that goes to show the price of a player like Laughton. If they were going all in, I mean, maybe it would make some sense giving up one of your best prospects for Scott Laughton, but it is a rental. And I don't know how much of a difference he's going to make to this cup contender if you're giving up Fraser Minten as well. Some would argue you're better off just throwing Fraser Minten in the fire at the third line center and seeing what happens going forward, although Scott Laughton is the better player at this point.
I think that, adding a lot into this lineup would add a lot to the lineup. Like, I think that he would actually help the team, especially in that role. I think that he would add a lot to the lineup. He can actually move up the lineup as well, which I think is very attractive for the Leafs, and that's the whole reason that they want to acquire him. But a swap like this makes no sense. I'm glad to see that last part, that the Leafs did turn this down, because Fraserman straight up for Scott Laughton with no other pieces involved and any of that doesn't make sense to me. I think Fraserman has a lot of upside. And I was saying a couple weeks ago, like, I'd be open to trading Easton Cowan if the trade was a little bit bigger and stuff like that. We were talking about that. But Fraserman, I think, has a lot of upside still. I think that he could be a better player than Scott Laughton at some point. So I don't know if I would do that straight up. Doesn't make too much sense for me. But I do wonder, as the days go on here, like if we get to tomorrow, obviously they're playing tomorrow night. If we get to Thursday with the deadline being Friday, And there aren't any other teams that are pulling the trigger either. If the Flyers go, you know what, we would really like some assets for this player, maybe we would be open to a second round pick and another prospect or something like that, right? So I do wonder if they're just kind of playing the waiting game with some of these and then kicking tires on some other options, which we've been talking about of a lesser degree. I think that's kind of the plan right now. And then to circle back on things if nothing happens with Laughton. So it's going to be interesting, but a straight up trade Fraserman for Scott Laughton. I still think that Scott Laughton makes the team better right now, but a straight up trade doesn't make sense for me long term.
Yeah, $3 million cap hit. A UFA after 2026, so I guess he isn't an expiring after this year, but you get an extra year of control, which is good. Uh, I would be more interested in like a second round pick in Topi Namela, something like that, a framework regarding that. Maybe you give the Flyers an extra prospect, still fairly highly touted, not as good as Fraser Minton. But something else I want to bring up here is that this also dropped. The Leafs will not shop roster players like Domi, Robertson, or Connor Dewar as they want to keep their depth. However, if they need to clear salary to add a player with term, these non-core forwards aren't entirely off limits. So a bit of a contradicting report in that, but what I read that as is that the Leafs aren't actively shopping Max Domi, Nick Robertson, or Connor Dewar, but if a trade comes along to where you need to add one of those players to get it done, then they will get it done. So they aren't trying to trade those guys. Specifically, Max Domi is the biggest one here. However, if a trade comes up for, also we used to talk about, and we still have, Scott Laughton in a deal, pairing Rasmus Ristolainen, something like that, which is also, of course, we've talked about that in the past, add a bigger deal in general, then they might be willing to add a guy like Max Domi. But it's interesting, they're not going to actively shop Max Domi or Nick Robertson, which we thought was going to be the case, but Robo's been playing better lately. He said he wants to stay in Toronto, so I guess it makes a little bit of sense to take the pressure off them.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think that's exactly what this is saying. Like, they're not actively shopping Max Domi and Nick Robertson, which we thought could happen at this year's trade deadline. But obviously, if a trade comes along that makes them better and it includes Nick Robertson or Max Domi to make the salary work, or a team wants Nick Robertson returned for a high-end player like Mikko Rantanen or something like that, that would make a lot of sense. But I don't think they're actively shopping them. The reason, the most surprising part of that to me is not actively shopping Nick Robertson after everything that happened over the last 12 months, right? And I think that's because he is starting to play differently. He's not putting up the points that he has maybe even last year, right? But he's playing a more dynamic game. He really is. And even seeing him live last night, you can see it. He's finishing checks. He's playing a little bit differently, and maybe he's not scoring as much because of it, but I think that that's okay because the goals will follow him, right? He has the shot. He has the scoring ability. So I don't think he's just a shot anymore, which kind of was just his thing, his shtick for a while. He's added more to his game. He's a good forechecker. He's throwing hits. He's getting into it after the whistle. Like, the third line gets into it after the whistle a lot the last little while, which I really like. So he's adding more to his game, which I think can help him in the playoffs if he is to get into a game. So we haven't seen that before from him. He's starting to add that this season. So he's proven to be very valuable in that way. And it continues to progress the last couple of games, which is good. So I still don't know if he has a future with this team beyond this season. But for the time being, the way that he's playing, if there's a trade, why would you actively shop him? Keep him. And injuries happen, right? Maybe he doesn't get into the lineup right away in the playoffs. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with the lineup, but keep him around. Injuries happen. Maybe he comes in, he'll score a couple goals for you. And I've been liking the way he's been playing. I've always liked the way he's played, but he's added another side to his game as well.
And he's looked a lot better under Craig Berube as opposed to Sheldon Keefe. So maybe they want to play the upside. Let's not forget, he is a pending RFA, not UFA. So if they do want to keep him, they can match any contract. And I can't imagine he's going to get a huge contract because, if anything, albeit this down season hurts the Leafs in the sense of his production, but it helps them when it comes to retaining him going forward because he's going to get a smaller contract this offseason than he would have last after his decent campaign last season. But let us know down below what your thoughts are. Tons of videos coming out, so make sure to stay tuned. Hit the subscribe button. See you guys later.